Hello, this is the Provoked Prawn, and this is the Montech King 95. This is the standard version, not the Pro model, but I've built in this case in a variety of ways, and I want to talk about the case and show you what's possible with it, talk about the flaws and the highlights, the things that are awesome and the things that are a little bit tricky. This is actually a fairly nice case at the end of the build, as you can see, and you will spy some differences in it as well, because I've also set it up with a vertical GPU mount and different options in terms of the fan mounting and orientation. I'm going to go through all of the build and things I found, and then I'm going to show some benchmarks at the end, so stick around for that. Now, as you'll see, it's the dual chamber fish tank style of case, which means that you've got a lot of glass potentially showing you what's inside. I'm going to rewind back to the beginning for the initial unboxing and show you what you get and sort of the process of taking it apart and some of the things of interest there. But this is actually a very flexible case with plenty of different mounting options for radiators, fans, storage, and more. It has some fairly easy removable panels. The top just pulls off. Note that. Be careful when you're picking it up. If you're trying to move it around, don't just grab it by the top and try and lift it, because it will just come off. Interestingly, it's got dust shielding in it, but it's not removable. So there's fine mesh on there, but you can't actually take that out, so you'd have to clean the entire thing once you've removed it. The side and front glass panels come off with some tugging and removing of thumb screws, and are relatively easy to remove there. And at the bottom you've got a nice large removable dust tray as well to stop the ingress of dirt from the underneath, which is pretty nice. The rear panel also has a lot of potential for airflow, as you can see, and again, like the top, it also has a built-in mesh which you can't remove, so you'd have to clean that when you get to it, perhaps giving it a wash over time, or at least using some compressed air to blow it out. Now, inside the box you also get this little container which has all the accessories in it, which includes this front mesh panel. So this isn't an optional accessory, it's not an after purchase, it actually comes with the case, giving you the option to swap out that front glass panel for this mesh one instead, if you want more airflow, if you're favouring that over the look of having all the glass, which I think is a really nice addition, because usually with these sorts of cases you'd have to pay extra for something like that, and then, you know, replace whatever else you've got in there and swap the glass out and have some extra fans that you'd need to put in. Now, note the King 95 comes with no fans as standard, so the shots you've seen are ones that I've actually installed myself, so this is the look that you get. No fans included as standard, so you'd have to think about the fans you're going to use and plan that out. More on that in a minute. You'll see at the rear we've got a lot of potential here for various different things, and this rear door is held on with two little screws at the top and bottom, which seems nice in theory, at least when it's built, but became a right pain when I was trying to build in it, because it kept coming open during the build process, so I kept having to screw it back together just to keep it shut, which is a minor point, but one annoyance. You'll see there's plenty of space in here for actually a multitude of radiators and fan installations. So in theory you can mount a 360mm radiator on the top, which I'll show you in a second, and then they say you can mount a 280mm radiator on the side here. You'll also notice if you unscrew the thumb screws, this panel pulls out and goes towards the front. So with a little adjustment you can make it go towards the front of the case, and then it just screws in place with a couple of brackets there. Now, this is how you'd set it up with the airflow panel that I just showed you. So you can put up to two 140mm fans at the front, or two 120mm, and then you have the option of setting it up so you've got better airflow across there. Now, obviously, you could also install a radiator as an option, and I'll show you that in a second, but it's interesting in the way this works because it's fairly unusual. But again, it's a nice addition because you don't have to pay extra for a bracket to mount fans to the front to go along with that airflow panel. Instead, you just maneuver this, put the fans on it, and then set it up so you end up with this view and a much nicer airflow potential. So that's pretty nifty, a nice setup for it. And then you can see you can also side mount some fans still, as I've done here. So we've still got a lot of fans, and I've filled it up with fans there, and we'll talk a bit about that in a minute. Now, it does say that you can mount a 280mm radiator to the side. However, as you can see, you can't put it in that tray that I just showed you to put towards the front. 280 is just too big for this, it won't fit in. This is an NZXT all-in-one cooler. It's the 280mm RGB version. it just plain wouldn't fit. However, I got a 240mm radiator just to check, and that will fit. So if you're going for 240, you could potentially put it in there. And I would suggest if you're just going to have the glass on the front, that might be preferable to do that, because you'll have a nicer view. Because the thing with this panel is if you move it around, as you can see into the back a lot more, and it exposes a lot more of the cables. So I actually don't think a 280mm radiator on the side is that nice looking, as you'll see from some of the shots. You can also obviously unscrew this front tray and remove it if you want to, so you can get it out of the way if you're not planning on using it. So you can see here with the 280mm radiator mounted to that back panel, for example, it goes through the gap where that fan tray was, and then all the wires sort of go towards the back. And instead you're mounting it to the back of the case. Now, I will note this makes the build process pretty fiddly, depending on how you do it. I made a mistake of doing this pretty early, which then meant I had to negotiate with the radiator mounted on the side all the time while doing all the other things. And I don't really like the way it's sort of put in there, because it's not hiding as much of the cables away, which you might spy in some of these shots. It's fairly easy to install though, because it does just have your standard radiator screws screwing through the back there. And obviously, as you've seen, you've got some pretty good airflow with that rear panel as well. Now, there is a reasonable amount of space at the back here. I initially started by not doing very much cable tidying, because I wanted to check, as I always do, just how flexible it was in terms of what you can install. There are some Velcro ties in there, and I do some tidying later on, but if you just see with a mess of cables, a controller, all the fan cables, power cables and other things, you can just jam it all in there and close the door. The one downside is without that fan tray on the side, some of these are visible, so you have to do a lot of work to sort of hide them away and make sure that you can't see them as much from the front. So it doesn't do as good a job as other cases I've seen of hiding your shame away if you're not being really neat at the back. So I would suggest you probably do have to be quite neat and plan out your build beforehand and tidy things up a lot as well. But it does have quite a lot of room there. You can see I've got a lot jammed in there, and the door still closed pretty successfully. An alternative radiator setup is for top mounting a radiator. Now the top fan tray is actually removable. If you want to, you can take this out if it's going to make the build process easier, or obviously you could just mount the radiator in there while it's in situ, but it's held in place with 4 screws, and then you just remove this and set it up. You can have up to a 360mm radiator on the top, so it's pretty flexible in that way. And again, I'm using an NZXT one here with a Kraken Z73. The fact this bracket's removable makes it really easy to install this, because you've just got to flip your radiator over, make sure you've got everything facing in the right direction, and then screw it in. You've got the positions to set it up with a 280 as well if you'd want to, so you have options to go for a larger, fatter radiator if you want to, rather than the 360. But I'm mounting a 360 here because I wanted to fill it up with as many fans as possible. So this then just drops in from the top, and you can just secure everything as you want to in here. You'll notice I've got a lot of fans going on in this setup as well. More on that in a minute, because the way the fan setup is pretty interesting in terms of the mounting, especially at the bottom, because you will find a number of accessories for installing things. So this process, you can see here, we're talking with a 360mm radiator. Obviously, I've got the front fans installed. I've got side fans as well. Again, there's a lot of cables exposed, and the way the rear side fans are sitting, they sit quite far back. I'm not sure whether I like this aesthetic or not. Depends what angle you've got to have the case at and other things, but you can see they're kind of nestled away at the rear. Also, you will notice there's a SATA cable poking out from the side there, which I haven't tucked away properly, which shows how easy it is to accidentally expose cables. Obviously, once I realized that, I tidied things up a bit and pushed them to the rear, but you can still see there's a lot of exposed cables on the side there, so it's not perfect, which is a shame. Back to that accessories box, because inside this little box is not only that front panel, but some other things of interest as well. So there are a number of things in here. Obviously, you've got a manual, you have a little box with all the screws in it, which is actually very neatly organized, and I really appreciated this because each of the sections is already sectioned off, so the screws are in their own little hole. They're in a bag, so you have to take them out, but you'll see that there's labeling on the box to tell you what screws go where and what they're for, which is really nice, especially for beginners, and it makes just keeping that organized yourself really easy because they're just there already and set up for you. You can also reference the manual to see what accessories they are, and clearly labelled in there, and where they're used, so it's really straightforward. The other thing that's included is this tray here, which is an SSD and a hard disk drive tray. Now, this is another interesting option. It shows you the potential of the case because there's actually loads of storage potential in here. So you can mount 3 2.5-inch SSDs or up to 3 hard disk drives to this tray, and there's different screws for doing it. So you have the little anti-vibration rubber washers, for example, for the hard disk drives. You can just secure those in, and then this tray sits in the bottom of the case, so it slots in down where the fans would go normally, and you can secure it into there. Now, I personally wouldn't do this because obviously it's going to negatively impact the airflow on your graphics card because you're not going to have any air blowing from the bottom. However, if storage is more important to you and maybe you don't have a GPU that runs that hot, or you've got the side and front fans set up as intake, it might be okay. I haven't done any thermal testing with this, but I wanted to show what's possible here. So you could have loads of drives at the front of the case, and the cables are kind of neat, apart from the power cables, which were a bit difficult to negotiate. The alternative is you can mount them at the rear. So you can put one on the side of the hard disk drive cage, which I'll show you in a second. You can also mount 2 to the door here. So you can put 2 SSDs on the door, and that's fairly easy too because it's just some screws to screw it in. Then you've got to try and run the power cables. Now that's the tricky part that's worth bearing in mind, because you have to run power cables from your PSU and obviously data cables from those drives to your motherboard as well without being able to see them from the front. So not necessarily ideal. But inside the little box, you also get these little black screws, which you can screw into the SSD, and then you can push it in really simply to mount it on that hard disk drive cage instead. So these basically just screw in there, and then it just slots in, which is a much easier installation process than screwing it into the door. But again, you're seeing loads of options. You have the option to mount it on the front, you've got options to mount it on the side panels, and you can open up the rear here and then pull out these hard disk drive cages as well. Now you can put SSDs or hard disk drives in there. You have the option, and I'm going for hard disk drives just to show you because it's pretty standard, but these are a plastic bracket. The drive just slots in, and then you can screw it in as well. The manual shows you how you could put SSDs in here as an alternative, but I wanted to show you the different potential options. So that's the one thing about this case, is there's absolutely loads of storage options. If storage is really important and you want hard disk drives or SSDs, you can just slap loads in this case, assuming you can manage the cables and that you have no need for as many fans. So as you can see, this case is very flexible in what you do with it and how you set it up, both in terms of radiator mounting and the hard drives and storage setup as well. So it's got lots of flexibility to it. Now it's an ATX case, which means it will take an ATX motherboard out of the box really easily. No worrying about adjusting the standoffs there. So this is the Asrock Livemixer Z790 motherboard. Now, one thing that I did note is that doing tubes down on the radiator like this does mean that they're pressing up against the bottom, which does make me worry that maybe it could damage the tubes quite easily. So something to keep in mind, but I do know that people like to put their radiators this way round. However, if it is a 240, probably wouldn't have the same problem, but the 280 just touching the bottom there, which made me a bit anxious. Now, I've used a couple of different GPUs in this setup, and I'll talk about that in a second, but this is a 4070 Ti. Now, for the fan setup, you can see I've got a mix of 140 and 120 millimeter Montech fans, including some reverse blade fans. I used a Thermalright RGB and fan hub for this, and I'm going to do a separate wiring guide on this if you're curious, if you're planning on doing the same thing. But the thing that's interesting is you can put 2 140 millimeter fans on the bottom. It looks like there's space for 3, but you can only mount 2. So that's worth keeping in mind. And that's one of the reasons why I've got a space there, because I didn't have enough fans to fill up the bottom. The other one is you couldn't do it because there's not actually any holes there, which is interesting. So there's no holes for 140. You could put 3 120 millimeter fans at the bottom though, so keep that in mind. With this, it's also interesting because the fans come with their own screws. So if you are mounting them to the bottom like this, you've got some long fan screws included in the accessories box that you'd run through from the top. Now this is pretty curious in more than one way. First of all, usually you'd screw fans in from the underside, not from the top like this. You'll also notice that we're passing the screws through the fans into dedicated holes for each of them on the tray itself, so on the bottom of the case. Now this is really unusual because usually you'd have a long sort of strip where you could screw the fans in, which would then give you the ability to adjust the position left to right, for example. Whereas with this design, we're kind of stuck with them jammed into the corner here with this big open gap on the right-hand side where you can't put anything. So if you go for 140mm fans, you're set up, and this is the end of how you'd have it. So you've got this massive gap. It doesn't look great, I don't think, and it hurts my feelings because you can't have like a symmetrical full build with all the fans in there. Now, this is only the case with the 140mm fans because you can put 320mm fans, as I've shown, but maybe they've done it like this because of the front tray where you could put fans at the front there. Bit odd. Very strange design choice. The other thing I noticed is that with these fans mounted blades down, if you screw the screws too tight on the 140mm fans, it actually results in an angry noise from the fan blades. And it wasn't just the Montech fans, it was other fans as well. I checked with the deep cool fans. I just found that the fans were making this really loud noise, and that's only if you tighten them all the way up. If you make them a little bit looser, it's not a problem. But that's another strange choice there. So maybe reverse blade fans might be a better option. With the 120mm fans, I didn't see the issue as much, which is also strange. Maybe it's unique to me. It could be there's a slight bend in the bottom of the case. I'm not sure. But with the 120mm, you'll see, again, from the top view, that the long screws just go through the fans and into the holes for them below. But again, you can't adjust the position of them. So if you're not happy with how they sit, tough luck, because you can't just slide them to the left, for example. This is how it works, and that the setup for those, and then they're just secured in like that. Strange fan setup, but it does look nice when you filled it up. Now, in terms of the power supply, I'll leave all the specs in the description as to what it can take, but this is a Montech 850 watt power supply unit, which obviously you can face to the outside, so it pulls cold air through the rear of the case quite easily. You've seen already that there's plenty of room for the cables in there, and it's fairly simple to install this, but obviously you might be opting for a different power supply, so I just wanted to demonstrate the size of what this is. So this is an 850 watt, and you can get an idea of the length of that and how much room it takes up and the cabling for it. But I've also got this larger Corsair HX 1500 watt power supply, which, as you can see, is quite a bit bigger, but yet it still fits in there, and it is possible to put the cables through. So there's plenty of space at the rear for larger power supplies if you're going to put a really hefty system in there. And you'll actually see I ended up with a 4090 in this build, just to demonstrate how much room there is in the case. So you might want to combine high-end specs with a big power supply unit, and if you do, you can probably fit it in without much of a bother. Now, in terms of the cable management, I initially showed sort of chucking all the cables in so you could shut the door, but you can use the Velcro loops there, and there are a few different points where you can cable tie the cables and just hide them away at the bottom as well. You could also obviously cable tie, and I would recommend doing it on the fans at the top so that you can hide them out of the way so they're not as visible from the front, and you can do a lot of that around here. There's also some extra Velcro ties included in the box, so you could theoretically temporarily tidy things up as well. So in theory, there's plenty of ability to cable tie, so if you're really good at it, you can do it, and I would recommend going to the effort of doing it, because even when I've done it a little bit here, it still ends up being a little bit visible through the front, which isn't ideal, but it's definitely neater than it was. As you can see, I've ended up with a mix of NZXT and Montech fans in here, which means the RGB doesn't sync initially, but on a separate video on how to sort that out that I'll link to in the description. Now, this case has two USB-A and a USB-C connection on the front panel, as well as mic and headset, and it has a power button and a reset switch. The advertising suggests that's an LED switch because there's an LED light down the side of it, but that's actually for the King 95 Pro. This can be wired into a 5V RGB header on here. You can then get the lighting to sync with your fans, which I've done using Signal RGB. So you can see you've got a nice glow from the front as well as from the fans themselves, assuming you've wired it all up correctly. I would recommend checking out that video on Signal because I go into a bit more depth on it. Now, I've vertically mounted the GPU in here with a Lee bracket, show it's possible, and this is the 4090, so you can see how much room there is, even with the front fans it's possible. Then I've done some benchmark tests on it with Port Royal and other 3D Mark tests, as well as obviously playing games with it and running Cinebench on there. But I basically wanted to get the CPU and the GPU up to temp, especially with the GPU, because naturally 4090 can run pretty hot. But you can see here the reports afterwards, you're actually not getting too toasty. We're looking at around 70 degrees maybe maximum, a little bit lower than that, somewhere in the 60 degrees on the GPU and the overall temperatures despite this test. Hardware monitor shows after gaming and after that benchmark, so we're looking at a maximum of 82 degrees on the hotspot and about 68 degrees on the GPU itself, which isn't too bad considering how much load we just put that under, and that is vertically mounted as well. Now I'm using an i3 processor in here, which makes no sense, but it's what I happen to have to hand, and you can see that topped out at around 60 degrees during that test as well, and with the gaming. So we also ran Cinebench with the 360mm radiator. Don't forget that's the setup we're testing in here at the moment. And again, the temps didn't go too high on it. You can see hardware monitor on the right hand side to get a look at those overall temperatures. They're both for the system and the CPU. Again, we're looking at around 63 degrees here. So with multiple fans and a big radiator, you can end up having a really cool system. It runs actually really quiet, despite that problem that I had with the bottom fans. Once you've got that sorted, the case is surprisingly quiet. And overall, I really like the build. I think it's a very nice case. A bit fiddly to build in, but quite roomy, very flexible in what you can do with it, and very nice looking as well by the end. Plus, you've got a choice of styles and how you set it up to your own personal preference. If you found this useful, check out the links in the description to other related content, and find out more down there as well about other things that you might find interesting. Thanks very much for watching. Subscribe if you haven't already. You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos. You might well find them interesting or useful. And most importantly, have a great life.